Have you ever felt invisible? Like the world just passes you by without seeing you? That's exactly how 57-year-old Walter Pine feels every single day. Walter is a mechanic who lives in the back of his small auto shop. He sits alone on the curb eating lunch when a little girl walks up to him. She holds coins in her small hands, and her eyes are full of sadness. Her question breaks his heart. "Mister, can I buy you?" She thinks buying someone means they won't be lonely anymore. Her father pulls her away, embarrassed by his daughter's words. But Walter can't forget what she said. Something beautiful begins between this broken man and this little girl who understands his pain. What happens when two lonely souls find each other will touch your heart forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through grimy windows, casting long shadows across Walter Pine's auto shop. Dust particles danced in the golden beams as he pulled himself from the narrow cot in the back office, his joints protesting the familiar routine. At 57, his body carried the weight of decades spent bent over engine blocks, his hands permanently stained with grease that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Walter's morning ritual never varied. He folded the thin blanket and stored the cot behind filing cabinets filled with repair orders dating back 15 years. The hot plate on his makeshift counter gurgled to life, brewing coffee in a dented pot that had seen better decades. His breakfast consisted of instant oatmeal and whatever fruit he could afford from the corner market. The shop itself told the story of a man who had once dreamed bigger dreams. Faded certificates hung crooked on the walls. His automotive certification from 1989, a community college diploma, a letter of appreciation from the volunteer fire department. In the corner, barely visible beneath a dusty top, sat a 1967 Mustang Fastback that he'd been working on for 12 years. The car represented everything he'd once believed he could accomplish, now serving as a monument to abandoned hopes. Hidden beneath his worn work shirt, a thin gold chain held a simple wedding band. Walter touched it unconsciously throughout the day, a gesture so ingrained he barely noticed it anymore. The ring belonged to memories he'd buried so deep that sometimes he could almost forget they existed. The neighborhood knew Walter as the man who could fix anything. Mrs. Kowalski brought him her ancient washing machine when it wheezed its last breath. Old Pete from the barber shop trusted him with his delivery truck that had over 300,000 miles. Children knew him as the quiet man who would retrieve their toys when they bounced into his yard, returning them with a gentle nod and nothing more. "Morning, Walter." Benny Clearwater pushed through the shop's front door, bell chiming overhead. At 24, Benny was everything Walter had never been: outgoing, ambitious, unafraid of tomorrow. He'd started working part-time at the shop 2 years ago, officially to learn the trade. Though Walter suspected Benny stayed more out of kindness than necessity. "Benny," Walter nodded, already pulling on his coveralls. "Mrs. Rodriguez's Civic is ready. Alternator was shot, but she's running smooth now." Benny grabbed the keys from the hook by the register. "You know, Walter, you could charge more for your work." "That alternator job. Rico's garage would have charged twice what you did." Walter shrugged, opening the hood of a Ford pickup that had arrived the previous evening. "People around here don't have money to throw around." "Yeah, but you don't either." Benny's voice carried gentle concern. "When's the last time you took a real day off? Or bought yourself something that wasn't strictly necessary?" The question hung in the air like exhaust fumes. Walter couldn't remember the last time he'd purchased anything for pleasure. His clothes came from the thrift store, his food from the discount bin at the grocery store. He lived so small, so quietly, that some days he wondered if he was disappearing entirely. "I'm fine," Walter said, which was what he always said. The day proceeded like countless others before it. Mrs. Rodriguez picked up her Civic with tears of gratitude because Walter had fixed it for the cost of parts plus $20 labor. A teenager brought in a bicycle with a busted chain, and Walter repaired it for free while the boy watched with fascination. An elderly man named Frank needed help changing his truck's oil. and Walter guided him through the process patiently, charging nothing for the lesson. At lunchtime, Walter sat on the concrete curb outside his shop. The neighborhood bustled around him, mothers pushing strollers, delivery trucks rumbling past, children racing home from school. He watched it all while eating a peanut butter sandwich from a paper bag, feeling like a ghost observing the world of the living. That's when she appeared. The little girl couldn't have been more than 6, with dark curls escaping from a blue headband and a dress that probably cost more than Walter spent on food in a month. She carried herself with the careful precision of a child who'd learned early to be mindful of adult moods. In her small hands, she clutched a collection of coins, quarters, dimes, a few nickels that caught the afternoon light. She stopped directly in front of Walter, studying him with the intense curiosity that only children possess. Her eyes, wide and serious, seemed to see straight through to parts of himself he'd forgotten existed. "Mister," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can I buy you?" Time stopped. The rumble of traffic faded. The distant sounds of construction disappeared. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Walter stared at this small person who had just asked the most extraordinary question he'd ever heard. Before he could respond, a man in an expensive suit rushed toward them, his face flushed with embarrassment and irritation. "Lily, what are you doing?" He grabbed the child's arm, pulling her back from Walter. "I'm so sorry," he said quickly, not quite meeting Walter's eyes. "She's been acting strange lately." "Come on, Lily!" The man, clearly her father, hurried her toward a black Mercedes parked at the curb. A woman in a navy blazer, probably the nanny, waited by the passenger door with patient resignation. But Lily twisted in her father's grip, looking back at Walter with eyes that held an understanding far beyond her years. "I wanted to buy you so you wouldn't be lonely," she called out as her father lifted her into the car. Walter sat frozen on the curb long after the Mercedes disappeared down the street. The coins lay scattered where Lily had dropped them in her father's haste to leave. He gathered them slowly, 147 in total. A fortune to a 6-year-old, an offering from a heart that recognized another heart in need. For the first time in years, Walter Pine felt seen. Walter couldn't sleep that night. He lay on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling where shadows from passing headlights swept across water-stained tiles. Lily's words echoed in his mind. "I wanted to buy you so you wouldn't be lonely." The innocence of it, the pure intention behind such an impossible request, had cracked something open inside his chest. He rose before dawn and busied himself with work, but his hands moved automatically while his thoughts remained fixed on a little girl who saw his loneliness so clearly. By mid-morning, he'd rebuilt a carburetor, changed 2 sets of brake pads, and organized his tool bench twice. "You're making me nervous," Benny said, watching Walter scrub a wrench that was already spotless. "What's got into you?" Walter set down the wrench and looked at his young employee. "Yesterday, a child asked me something I can't stop thinking about." "What kind of question?" "She wanted to know if she could buy me." Benny raised an eyebrow. "Buy you? Like hire you for a job?" "No." Walter shook his head. "She had coins in her hands. She thought she could purchase me so I wouldn't be lonely anymore." The weight of those words settled between them. Benny set down his coffee cup and studied Walter's face. "That's either the sweetest or the saddest thing I've ever heard." "Both," Walter said quietly. Around noon, Mrs. Kowalski shuffled into the shop carrying a plate of pierogi wrapped in aluminum foil. She was 73, a widow who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than Walter had been alive. "For you," she said, setting the plate on his workbench. "You fixed my washer last week, saved me $200 at least." "I told you, Mrs. Kowalski, you don't need to—" "Hush!" She waved a dismissive hand. "I heard something interesting from my neighbor. She works for those rich folks in the Carlisle house on Maple Street. Has a little girl there. Very sad child, apparently." Walter's hands stilled on the socket wrench he'd been holding. "Sad? Father's always working, never pays attention. The nanny, sweet girl from Ireland, says the little one talks about a nice man who fixes cars. Asked her daddy for coins to buy herself a friend." Mrs. Kowalski's eyes crinkled with understanding. Children see what adults pretend not to notice. After she left, Walter found himself walking to the front window of his shop repeatedly, watching the street. He told himself he was just checking for customers, but his gaze lingered on every black car that passed. At 3:30, his patience was rewarded. The Mercedes pulled up to the curb, and Walter watched as the nanny, a young woman with auburn hair, helped Lily from the back seat. The child immediately looked toward his shop, and when she spotted him in the window, her face lit up with a smile that could have powered the entire building. The nanny followed Lily's gaze and seemed to make a decision. She took the little girl's hand and walked directly to Walter's shop. "Good afternoon," the nanny said in a soft Irish accent. "I'm Nora Quinn. This is Lily Carlyle. I believe you two have met." Walter crouched down to Lily's eye level. "Hello, Lily. You dropped some coins yesterday." She nodded solemnly. "Daddy said I was bothering you." "You weren't bothering me at all." Walter's voice was gentler than it had been in years. "I was just surprised by your question." "I brought you something," Lily said, reaching into a small pink backpack. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, a drawing made with crayons. The artwork showed two stick figures holding hands in front of what was clearly meant to be his auto shop. One figure was tall with brown hair, the other small with curly dark hair. Above them, she'd written Lily and Walter in uneven block letters. "You know my name," Walter said, accepting the drawing with careful hands. "I asked around the neighborhood," Nora explained. "Everyone speaks very highly of you, Mr. Pine." Walter studied the drawing, noting details that revealed Lily's attention to his world. She'd drawn tools hanging on the walls, a car with its hood up, even the small cot in the corner that she couldn't possibly have seen from outside. "This is beautiful, Lily. Thank you. I wanted to draw what it would look like if I bought you," she said matter-of-factly. "So you could see that it would be nice." Walter's throat tightened. "Can you tell me what it means to buy someone?" Lily considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher. "Well, when Daddy buys things, he gets to keep them and take care of them. And when you buy someone, it means you get to be their family, and they can't be lonely anymore because you're there." The simplicity of her logic was devastating. Walter glanced at Nora, who was watching the interaction with knowing eyes. "That's a very kind way to think about it," Walter said. "But you can't really buy people, Lily. We're not things in a store." Her face fell slightly. "Then how do you get a family if you don't have one?" The question hit Walter like a physical blow. He saw himself reflected in this small person. The longing, the careful hope, the fear that maybe family was something other people had, but not him. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "families just happen. Sometimes people find each other and decide to care about each other, and that's how families grow." "Like how?" Walter looked at the drawing again, at the careful way she depicted them standing together. "Like when someone draws a picture of you and makes you feel less alone in the world." Lily's smile returned, brilliant and transformative. "So maybe we're already starting to be family." Before Walter could answer, a car horn honked impatiently from the street. Through the shop window, he could see a man in a business suit checking his watch with obvious irritation. "That's Mr. Carlyle?" Nora said quietly. "We should go." Lily looked disappointed but didn't argue. She'd learned early not to keep her father waiting. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Walter looked at Nora, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. "I think that would be fine." "Really?" Lily's eyes went wide. "Really?" After they left, Walter pinned Lily's drawing to the bulletin board above his workbench, right next to his automotive certificates. For the rest of the afternoon, he found himself glancing at it, at the simple crayon figures holding hands. That evening, long after he'd closed the shop, Walter sat on his cot holding the coins Lily had dropped the day before. 1.47. Not enough to buy much in the material world, but somehow it felt like the most valuable thing he'd ever been offered. For the first time in 15 years, Walter Pine went to sleep thinking about tomorrow. Walter woke before his alarm, something that hadn't happened in years. The anticipation of Lily's visit had given him a restless energy he'd forgotten he could feel. He found himself cleaning the shop with unusual care, moving tools to their proper places and wiping down surfaces that hadn't seen attention in months. His father's old toolbox sat on the corner workbench. Its red paint faded and chipped, but still sturdy after 4 decades. Walter ran his fingers along its familiar edges, remembering the day his father had given it to him. "A man's tools tell his story," the old man had said. "Take care of them, and they'll take care of you." The toolbox contained more than wrenches and screwdrivers. It held the weight of tradition, the honest pride of work done well. Walter had carried it through 3 decades of repairs, and now its presence seemed to anchor him as everything else in his world began to shift. "You're humming," Benny observed when he arrived for work. "I didn't know you could hum." Walter hadn't realized he was making any sound at all. "Just thinking about that little girl." Among other things, Walter picked up a socket wrench, then set it down again. "Benny, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you think it's possible for someone to change who they are? After a certain age, I mean." Benny leaned against the workbench, considering the question seriously. "My grandmother used to say people don't change, they just become more themselves. But I think maybe she was wrong. I think sometimes life cracks you open, and you get to decide what grows in the space that's left." The wisdom in those words surprised Walter. He'd underestimated his young employee, seeing only his cheerful surface without recognizing the depth beneath. At 3:30, the familiar black Mercedes appeared. This time, Lily practically bounded out of the car, her face bright with excitement. Nora followed more slowly, carrying what appeared to be a small cooler. "Walter!" Lily rushed into the shop. "I brought you something." "Did you now?" Walter crouched down to her level, a gesture that was becoming natural. "Cookies! Nora helped me make them this morning." She looked up at the nanny for confirmation. "We made extra because Nora said working men need lots of food." Nora smiled apologetically. "I hope you don't mind." "She was very insistent that you might be hungry." Walter's chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't name. When was the last time someone had worried about whether he was hungry? "That was very thoughtful of you, Lily." The cookies were slightly lopsided chocolate chip creations, clearly made by small hands with limited coordination. Walter bit into one and made an exaggerated sound of appreciation that sent Lily into delighted giggles. "These are the best cookies I've ever had," he said, and meant it. "Really, really. Would you like to see what I'm working on?" For the next hour, Walter found himself doing something unprecedented, sharing his work with genuine enthusiasm. He showed Lily the engine he was rebuilding, explaining in simple terms how pistons moved and why oil was important. She listened with rapt attention, asking questions that demonstrated a surprisingly logical mind. "So the engine is like the heart of the car?" she asked, peering into the open hood of a Ford pickup. "That's exactly right. And just like hearts, sometimes they need a little help to keep beating strong. Do you fix people's hearts too?" The innocence of the question stopped Walter cold. He thought about his own heart, how it had stopped beating properly years ago and never quite found its rhythm again. "No, sweetheart. I only know how to fix car hearts. Maybe people's hearts fix themselves if you give them what they need," Lily said with the casual wisdom that only children possess. That evening, after Lily and Nora had left, Mrs. Kowalski appeared in the shop doorway carrying another covered dish. "Bigos," she announced, setting down the plate. "Polish stew." "You're getting too thin, Mrs. Kowalski. You don't have to keep feeding me. I don't have to do anything," she said briskly. "I want to." "There's a difference." She paused, studying his face. "You look different today." "Different how?" "Lighter, like someone lifted a weight you didn't know you were carrying." Her eyes narrowed with shrewd perception. "The little girl came back, didn't she?" Walter nodded, not trusting his voice. "Good. Children see the truth of people. If that child chose you, there's something in you worth choosing." After she left, Walter sat alone in his shop eating the stew and thinking about the day. Lily's drawing still hung above his workbench, and he found himself looking at it frequently. The stick figures seemed less crude now and more like a promise of something he'd given up hoping. Before, he pulled out a small notebook he used for repair, estimates, and began to write, not about car parts or labor costs, but about the day, about Lily's questions and her laughter, about the way she made him feel useful. in a way that had nothing to do with fixing engines. That night, Walter did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He knelt beside his cot and, feeling foolish but unable to stop himself, whispered a prayer of gratitude into the darkness. Somewhere in the silence that followed, he could almost hear an echo of his father's voice. A man's tools tell his story. Walter touched the wedding ring beneath his shirt, then looked toward the toolbox in the corner. Maybe it was time for his story to have a new chapter. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived with her sister's broken vacuum cleaner. Old Pete from the barber shop needed help with his delivery truck's stubborn starter. Even Father Martinez from St. Anthony's stopped by to ask if Walter could look at the church van that had been making concerning noises. Word was spreading through the neighborhood that Walter Pine was someone you could count on, someone who cared enough to do the job right. But more than that, people were beginning to see him, really see him for the first time. Benny noticed the change too. "It's like you've been hiding in your own life," he said as they worked side by side on a transmission repair. "Now you're finally stepping into the light." Walter didn't reply, but he understood what Benny meant. For years, he'd been sleepwalking through his days, going through the motions of living without actually being alive. Now, with the promise of Lily's daily visits and the growing warmth of community recognition, he felt himself awakening from a long, dreamless sleep. The transformation wasn't just in how others saw him, it was in how he was beginning to see himself. The routine of Lily's visits became the rhythm by which Walter measured his days. Every afternoon at 3:30, he found himself glancing toward the street, waiting for the familiar black Mercedes. Her presence had become as essential to his daily functioning as morning coffee or evening inventory. On Thursday, she arrived with a small potted plant, a daisy struggling in dry soil. It was dying on Mrs. Peterson's windowsill, Lily explained seriously. "She said I could have it if I promised to take better care of it. But I don't know how to make things grow." Walter accepted the pot with careful hands, noting how the leaves had turned yellow around the edges. "This little fellow just needs some attention. Sometimes that's all any of us need." He showed her how to test the soil with her finger, how to water slowly so the plant could drink without drowning. As they worked together, Lily chattering about her day at school, Walter found himself sharing small details about his own life, stories about difficult repairs, about customers who'd become friends over the years. "Do you have any family, Walter?" Lily asked, her attention focused on gently patting soil around the daisy's roots. The question hit him like a wrench, slipping and barking his knuckles. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His hand went automatically to the wedding ring hanging beneath his shirt, touching the warm metal through the fabric. "I did once," he said quietly. "What happened to them?" Walter had never spoken about it. Not to Benny, not to Mrs. Kowalski, not to anyone in all the years since. But something about Lily's gentle curiosity, her complete lack of judgment, made the words possible. "I was married to a wonderful woman to someone very special. She was going to have a baby. Our daughter." His voice caught on the word. "But sometimes life doesn't go the way we plan. Sometimes we lose the people we love most." Lily looked up from the plant, her dark eyes wide with understanding. "Like how I lost my mama?" Nora, who had been quietly organizing tools on a nearby bench, went very still. Walter realized he'd stumbled into territory he hadn't known existed. "Yes, sweetheart." "Like that. I was too," Lily said matter-of-factly. "I don't remember her very much, but Nora shows me pictures sometimes. She was very pretty and she used to sing to me." Walter's chest tightened. "I bet she did. Do you have pictures of your family?" Walter shook his head. He'd put them all away years ago, unable to bear the daily reminder of what he'd lost. But now, looking at this small girl who carried her own grief with such grace, he wondered if hiding from memories was the same as honoring them. That evening, after Lily and Nora had left, Walter did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He went to the filing cabinet where he kept important documents and reached behind the folders to a small wooden box he'd forgotten was there. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was a music box. The paint had faded and one corner was chipped. But when he wound the key, it still played "You Are My Sunshine" in sweet, tinkling notes. It had belonged to his wife, Rose. She'd played it every night before bed, humming along softly while she brushed her hair. After the funeral, he'd put it away because the sound was too painful to bear. Now, listening to the familiar melody in the quiet of his shop, he found that the pain had transformed into something softer, not gone, but bearable. The next day, Lily arrived with exciting news. "Walter! Guess what? The daisy has a new leaf." She practically vibrated with enthusiasm as she examined the plant, which Walter had been carefully tending in the shop window. "Look at that," he said, crouching beside her to admire the tiny green shoot. "You saved its life. We saved it," she corrected. Together. The word "together" seemed to hang in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither of them fully understood, but both of them felt. "Lily," Nora said gently, "we should talk about something. Your father has been asking questions about where you go after school." Walter felt his stomach drop. He'd been dreading this moment, knowing it would come eventually. "What kind of questions?" he asked. "He wants to know who you are, what your intentions are." Nora's voice was careful, diplomatic. "He's protective of Lily, naturally. Does he know about the visits?" "Not exactly. I've been selective with the information I share." Lily looked between the adults, her small face creased with worry. "Am I in trouble?" "No, sweetheart," Walter said quickly. "You're not in trouble. Your father just wants to make sure you're safe." "But you wouldn't hurt me," Lily said with absolute certainty. "You're good." "I can tell." The simple faith in her voice nearly undid him. Walter looked at Nora, seeing his own concern reflected in her eyes. "Maybe it's time I met your father properly," he said. Lily's face brightened. "Really? You want to meet Daddy?" Walter wasn't sure "want" was the right word, but he nodded anyway. "If he'd like to meet me, he will," Lily said with the confidence of a child who believed all problems could be solved with good intentions. "And when he sees how nice you are, everything will be perfect." That evening, Walter stood before the small mirror in his shop's tiny washroom, trying to see himself through the eyes of a wealthy businessman. His reflection showed a man worn down by years of hard work and harder losses. His face was lined, his hair more grey than brown, his clothes showing their age despite his best efforts to keep them clean. What could he possibly offer a man like James Carlyle? What could he say to justify his growing attachment to a little girl who wasn't his to love? But then he thought about Lily's laughter, about the way her face lit up when she saw him, about the daisy they'd saved together. Maybe love didn't require justification. Maybe it was enough that it existed, fragile and unexpected, like a flower growing in concrete. Walter touched the music box on his workbench, winding it once to hear Rose's favorite song. The melody seemed to carry a message across the years. Some things are worth the risk of heartbreak. Tomorrow he would meet James Carlyle. Tonight he would allow himself to hope that love might be stronger than fear. The confrontation Walter had been dreading came sooner than expected, and in a way he never could have anticipated. It was a Tuesday morning when the black Mercedes pulled up to his shop earlier than usual. Instead of Nora and Lily's cheerful entrance, a tall man in an expensive suit stepped out of the driver's seat. James Carlyle moved with the controlled urgency of someone accustomed to having his time respected and his questions answered. Immediately, Walter wiped his hands on a shop, rag, and walked outside to meet him. "Mr. Pine?" Carlyle's voice carried the crisp authority of boardrooms and negotiations. "I'm James Carlyle. I believe you know my daughter." "Yes, sir." "Lily's a wonderful little girl." "She is." Carlyle's eyes swept over the modest shop, taking in the faded paint and the practical simplicity of everything Walter had built. "Which is why I'm here. I need to understand what's happening between you and my daughter." The words were carefully chosen, neither accusatory nor friendly. Walter recognized the tone of a man gathering information before making a decision. "She visits me after school sometimes," Walter said simply. "We talk. I show her how things work." "And why would a grown man be interested in spending time with a 6-year-old child?" The implication behind the question hit Walter like a physical blow. He'd expected suspicion, but not this particular kind. His face flushed with indignation and hurt. "Because she's lonely," he said quietly. "And so am I. There's nothing more to it than that." Carlyle studied Walter's face, searching for deception and finding none. Some of the tension in his shoulders relaxed, but his wariness remained. "Lily talks about you constantly," Carlyle said. "Walter this, Walter that. Yesterday she asked me for money to buy you a present for something she calls Appreciation Day." Despite the awkwardness of the situation, Walter smiled. "She has a generous heart. She does. Too generous sometimes. She gets attached to people too easily, and when they inevitably leave..." Carlyle's voice trailed off, revealing more than he'd intended. Walter saw something he hadn't expected in the other man's eyes. Fear. Not fear of Walter, but fear for Lily. The protective instinct of a father who'd already watched his daughter suffer one devastating loss. "I'm not going anywhere." "Mr. Carlyle," Walter said, "how can you promise that? People die, they move away, they find better opportunities." Carlyle's composure cracked slightly. "Lily's mother promised she'd always be there too." The pain in those words was raw and immediate. Walter realized he was looking at a man who'd built walls around his heart just as high as his own, but for different reasons. Where Walter had retreated from the world to avoid further loss, Carlyle had tried to control it, to manage every variable that might hurt his daughter. "You're right," Walter said. "I can't promise I'll never leave, but I can promise that as long as I'm here, I'll care about her. She's safe with me, Mr. Carlyle. I would never hurt her. Intentionally, no. But what happens when she gets too attached and you realize this isn't what you want? What happens when the novelty wears off?" Walter was quiet for a long moment, considering how to explain something he barely understood himself. "About a week ago, your daughter brought me a dying plant," he said finally. "A little daisy that someone was throwing away. She asked me to help her save it, not because she particularly loved that plant, but because she couldn't bear to see something forgotten and dying." Carlyle frowned. "Clearly not understanding the relevance. That's who your daughter is. Mr. Carlyle, she sees things that need care and she can't help herself from caring. She didn't choose me because I'm special. She chose me because I needed choosing. And what does that make you in this equation?" Walter looked back at his shop, at the life he'd built in the margins of other people's lives. "The dying plant, I suppose. But the difference is I'm grateful. I know what she's given me, and I won't forget it." Something shifted in Carlyle's expression. The businessman's mask slipped, revealing a tired father who loved his daughter but didn't know how to connect with her. "She asks about you at dinner," Carlyle said quietly. "She wants to invite you to her birthday party next month. That's very kind of her. She also asks why I work so much, why I'm always on the phone, why I don't play with her the way you do." There was pain in Carlyle's voice. "I don't know how to be what she needs." Walter recognized the confession for what it was, a moment of vulnerability from a man who rarely allowed himself such exposure. "Maybe you don't have to be everything," Walter said gently. "Maybe it's enough to just be present when you can be." She lights up when she talks about your afternoons together. "I can't remember the last time she talked about spending time with me that way. She loves you, Mr. Carlyle. She talks about you all the time, too. How smart you are, how hard you work to take care of her. She's proud of you." Carlyle looked surprised. "She said that?" Children know when they're loved, even if they don't always understand how that love is expressed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Two men who'd found themselves responsible for the happiness of a little girl who deserved better than either of them, felt capable of giving. "I have a proposition," Carlyle said finally. "Lily's birthday is in 3 weeks. She wants to have the party here at your shop. Something about showing her friends where the magic happens." Walter's eyes widened. "Here? I'll pay for everything, food, decorations, entertainment. All you'd have to do is let us use the space and be yourself." Carlyle paused. "It would mean the world to her." Walter looked around his humble shop, trying to imagine it filled with children and birthday decorations. The idea terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. What about her friends? Won't their parents object to having a party in a garage? Let me worry about that. The question is whether you're willing. Walter thought about Lily's drawing still pinned to his bulletin board, about the daisy growing strong in his window, about the music box that had started playing again after 15 years of silence. Yes, he said, I'm willing. The weeks leading up to Lily's birthday transformed Walter's shop into something he barely recognized. What had once been a quiet refuge became a hub of activity as preparations took shape. Mrs. Kowalski appointed herself unofficial coordinator, arriving each morning with coffee and opinions about everything from table placement to color schemes. Purple and gold, she declared on a Wednesday morning, spreading fabric samples across Walter's workbench. Those are princess colors, and every little girl deserves to feel like a princess on her birthday. Walter had never planned a party in his life. The closest he'd come was buying a cake for his own birthday years ago, which he'd eaten alone while reading automotive magazines. Now he found himself learning about balloon arches and party favors with the intensity he usually reserved for engine diagnostics. Lily's excitement was infectious. She arrived each afternoon with new ideas, her small hands gesturing wildly as she described her vision for the perfect celebration. And we'll put lights everywhere, she said, spinning in a circle in the middle of the shop, like stars, but inside. And maybe we can show my friends how to fix things, like you showed me with the daisy. The daisy had indeed recovered, producing 3 bright yellow blooms that sat proudly on the windowsill. It had become a symbol of their friendship, proof that broken things could flourish with the right kind of attention. But as the party approached, Walter noticed troubling changes in Lily's demeanor. She seemed more fragile, more prone to sudden silences that hadn't been there before. "Is everything all right at home?" he asked one afternoon as they arranged chairs in what would become the party space. Lily's small shoulders sagged. "Daddy's been working even more than usual. He says he's trying to finish a big project before my birthday, but..." She trailed off, looking uncertain. But I think he's scared of the party. I heard him on the phone telling someone he didn't know how to talk to children besides me, and he was worried about embarrassing me in front of my friends." Walter's heart clenched. He was beginning to understand James Carlyle better, a man so afraid of failing his daughter that he was failing her in different ways instead. "Your father loves you very much," Walter said gently. "Sometimes grown-ups get nervous about things that seem easy to children. Were you nervous when you were little?" The question caught Walter off guard. He tried to remember himself at 6, before loss had taught him to be cautious with his heart. "Yes," he said honestly. "I was nervous about lots of things. But you know what helped?" "What?" "Having people who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." That evening, as Walter was closing up the shop, he heard a soft knock on the back door. He opened it to find James Carlyle standing in the alley, looking more disheveled than Walter had ever seen him. "I hope you don't mind," Carlyle said. "I saw your lights were still on." "Not at all. Come in." Carlyle entered the shop, his eyes taking in the party preparations with something that might have been wonder. Purple and gold streamers hung from the ceiling, and Mrs. Kowalski's carefully arranged chairs created an intimate circle in the center of the space. "It looks..." Carlyle paused, searching for words. "It looks magical. Lily has very specific ideas about what constitutes proper party ambiance," Walter said with a smile. "About that." Carlyle ran a hand through his hair. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Walter waited. "Am I a terrible father?" The raw vulnerability in the question stripped away all pretense. Walter saw past the expensive suit and the authoritative manner to the frightened man underneath. "Why would you ask that?" "Because my daughter talks to you the way she used to talk to her mother. Because she lights up when she sees you in a way she doesn't with me anymore. Because I'm standing in a mechanic's garage at 8 o'clock at night, asking for parenting advice from a man I barely know." Walter poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he kept warming on his hot plate. "You want to know what Lily told me about you last week?" Carlyle nodded, bracing himself. "She said you're the smartest person she knows. She said you work hard to make sure she has everything she needs. She said when she grows up she wants to be important like you are. She said that. She also said she wishes you weren't sad so much of the time. Carlyle's composure finally cracked. He sat heavily in one of Mrs. Kowalski's carefully arranged chairs and put his head in his hands. I don't know how to do this without her mother, he whispered. Patricia knew how to make everything light and happy. She knew how to play, how to be silly, how to make Lily laugh. I work. It's what I know how to do. Walter sat across from him, thinking about his own losses, his own failures to live fully in the wake of grief. Can I tell you something about your daughter? He said quietly. Carlyle looked up. She doesn't need you to be her mother. She needs you to be her father. She needs you to show up even if you don't know what to say. She needs you to be there, not perfect. But what if I say the wrong thing? What if I don't understand what she needs? Then you figure it out together. That's what parents do. They learn on the job. They sat in silence for a while. Two men grappling with the weight of loving someone more than they knew how to express. The music box, Carlyle said suddenly. What? Lily mentioned you have a music box that plays Patricia's favorite song. You Are My Sunshine. She used to sing it every night before bed. Walter's chest tightened. I didn't know. Patricia had the same music box. Lily broke it about a year ago, and I was too upset to have it repaired. I just put it away. Walter stood and walked to his workbench, returning with Rose's music box. He wound it carefully and set it between them. The sweet melody filled the space, carrying with it the ghosts of lullabies and lost love. Take it, Walter said. I couldn't take it. Some things are meant to be shared. Carlyle accepted the music box with trembling hands, cradling it like the precious thing it was. For the first time since Walter had met him, James Carlyle smiled. The morning of Lily's birthday arrived with unseasonable warmth for October. Walter had been awake since 4, unable to sleep with anticipation and nerves. He'd baked his first cake from scratch under Mrs. Kowalski's patient supervision the night before, and it sat covered on his workbench like a sweet, imperfect monument to his growing courage. By noon, the transformation of the shop was complete. Purple and gold balloons bobbed from every available surface, streamers created canopies of color overhead, and the carefully arranged tables sparkled with disposable plates that somehow managed to look elegant. The space hummed with an energy Walter had never felt before, the anticipation of joy deliberately created. Lily arrived early with Nora, her face bright with excitement as she surveyed the decorated space. "Walter, it's perfect!" "It's exactly like I imagined, but even better." She wore a purple dress with tiny gold stars embroidered along the hem and a small tiara that caught the light as she moved. She looked like exactly what Mrs. Kowalski had promised, a princess in her own magical kingdom. "Your guests should be arriving soon," Walter said, suddenly nervous about meeting the children who made up Lily's world outside of their afternoon visits. "There's only going to be 3, Lily said matter-of-factly. "Maya and Jessica and Connor. The other kids from my class are different." Something in her tone caught Walter's attention. "Different how?" "They don't really like me very much. They think I'm weird because I talk to adults more than I talk to kids, and because I know about car engines and they only care about toys and games." Walter's heart sank. He'd assumed Lily was popular, beloved by her classmates the way she was beloved by the adults in his neighborhood. The reality was more complicated and sadder than he'd realized. "Being different isn't a bad thing, Lily. I know. You told me that before, but it's lonely sometimes." Before Walter could respond, the first guests began to arrive. Maya was a small girl with bright red hair who immediately gravitated toward the daisy on the windowsill. Jessica wore a pink dress and regarded the garage setting with polite curiosity. Connor, the only boy, seemed fascinated by the tools hanging on the walls. James Carlyle arrived last, carrying a wrapped present and wearing an expression of carefully controlled anxiety. He'd dressed down for the occasion, khakis and a polo shirt instead of his usual business attire, but he still looked like a man attending a hostile board meeting. The party began, tentatively. The children were clearly uncertain about the unconventional venue, and Carlyle hovered at the edges of the group, like a man afraid to contaminate the proceedings with his presence. Walter found himself playing host, facilitating introductions and explaining the various aspects of his workspace that had captured the children's curiosity. "This is where Walter fixes things," Lily announced proudly, leading her friends around the shop like a tour guide. "He taught me that everything can be fixed if you're patient and you care enough to try." "Even people?" Maya asked with the directness that only children possess. Lily looked at Walter, then at her father, then back at Maya. "Especially people." The cake ceremony approached, and Walter had never felt more nervous in his life. He'd practiced lighting the candles, practiced carrying the cake without dropping it, even practiced leading a group in Happy Birthday. Nothing had prepared him for the actual moment. 6 candles flickering on homemade chocolate frosting, while 4 children and 3 adults looked on expectantly. But as they sang, something magical happened. The tentative voices grew stronger, more joyful. Carlyle found himself harmonizing unconsciously. The children began swaying to the rhythm, and Lily, radiant in the candlelight, looked happier than Walter had ever seen her. "Make a wish!" Jessica called out. Lily closed her eyes, concentrating, with the serious focus she brought to all important matters. When she opened them again, she looked directly at Walter, then at her father, and smiled before blowing out all 6 candles in one breath. "What did you wish for?" Connor asked. "I can't tell," Lily said solemnly, "but I think it might come true anyway." As the party continued, Walter noticed something that made his chest tight with emotion. James Carlyle was trying, really trying, to connect with the children. He knelt down to their eye level when they spoke to him. He asked genuine questions about their interests. When Maya spilled juice on her dress, he helped clean it up without any sign of impatience or judgment. Most importantly, he was present in a way Walter had never seen before. His phone remained in his pocket. His attention stayed focused on the moment unfolding around him. The breakthrough came during present opening. Lily had received typical gifts from her friends: books, a stuffed animal, art supplies. But when she opened her father's gift, her intake of breath was audible. Inside, the carefully wrapped box was Patricia's music box, beautifully restored. The wood gleamed with fresh polish, and when Lily lifted the lid, "You Are My Sunshine" filled the shop with its sweet melody. But it wasn't just any music box. Somehow, James had managed to have it customized. Inside the lid, where mirrors typically reflected the dancing ballerina, was a small photograph. Walter, Lily and James together, taken during one of their recent afternoon visits when none of them had been paying attention to Nora's phone camera. "Daddy," Lily whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "It's us. We're a family." The word hung in the air like a benediction. Walter felt his own eyes growing wet as he looked at the photograph. 3 people who had found each other across the landscape of loss and loneliness. "We are," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "All 3 of us." That's when Walter noticed the envelope tucked beneath the music box. James nodded toward it, encouraging Lily to look inside. She pulled out a legal document that meant nothing to her 6-year-old eyes, but everything to Walter's understanding ones. It was a petition for guardianship, papers that would make Walter legally part of Lily's life, with rights and responsibilities that went far beyond their afternoon visits. "I don't understand all the legal words," James said, addressing both Lily and Walter. "But what it means is that Walter would be family in every way that matters. If something ever happened to me, he would take care of you. And if something ever happened to him, we would take care of each other." Walter stared at the documents, unable to speak. In all his dreams of family, he'd never imagined anything like this, a conscious choice to bind their lives together legally and forever. "But there's one condition," James continued, and Walter's heart stopped. "Walter would have to move out of the shop. There's a small house 3 blocks from our place that just went up for rent. It has a garage where he could work, and a real bedroom, and a kitchen with actual counter space." "You want me to move?" Walter's voice was barely a whisper. "I want you to live," James said simply, All of us. Really live, not just survive. Lily had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now she stood and walked to Walter, taking his grease-stained hands in her small, clean ones. "Walter," she said with the gravity of a Supreme Court, justice delivering a verdict, "I want to officially buy you now, not with coins, but with love. Is that okay?" Walter looked around the shop that had been his refuge and his prison for so many years. Then he looked at the faces surrounding him. Lily's hopeful and certain, James's nervous but determined even. Maya and Jessica and Connor watching with the fascination of children, witnessing something important and adult. "Yes," he said, his voice breaking on the word. "That's okay." The cheer that went up from the party guests seemed to shake the very walls of the old building, and as Lily threw her arms around his neck and James clapped him on the shoulder, Walter finally understood what his wife Rose had meant when she used to say that families weren't just born, they were chosen day after day in moments of courage and commitment and love. The 3 weeks following Lily's birthday party passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Walter feeling as though he'd stepped into someone else's life. The guardianship papers sat on his workbench, signed but not yet filed, representing a future so different from anything he'd imagined that he sometimes forgot to breathe when he looked at them. The small house on Birch Street became the center of their collective attention. It was a modest 2-bedroom bungalow with a detached garage that needed work, but had good bones, as Mrs. Kowalski pronounced after her thorough inspection. The rent was reasonable, the neighborhood was safe, and most importantly, it was close enough to both Lily's school and James's office that their newly forming family routine could actually function. "The kitchen needs updating," James said, running his hand along countertops that had seen better decades, "and the bathroom could use some attention. But the electrical is sound and the plumbing works." Walter nodded, though he was still struggling with the concept of having an actual house. He'd lived in the back of his shop for so long that the idea of separate rooms for separate purposes felt almost decadent. "Are you sure about this?" he asked for the dozenth time. "The expense, the commitment—" "Walter," James interrupted gently, "stop asking if I'm sure. Start asking if you're ready. That was the real question, wasn't it? Readiness." Walter had spent so many years in survival mode that he'd forgotten how to plan for happiness. But Lily's enthusiasm was infectious, and her excitement about their family house made resistance impossible. She had appointed herself chief decorator and spent their afternoon visits sketching elaborate plans for each room. Walter would have a workshop in the garage, naturally, but also a proper bedroom with a real bed and a window that faced the garden. The living room would have bookshelves and comfortable chairs for reading together. The kitchen would have a proper table where they could eat meals and work on projects. "And we'll have a music corner," she announced one afternoon, carefully positioning Rose's music box on an imaginary shelf in her drawing, "where we can listen to Mama Patricia's song and think about happy things." The casual way she referred to both Patricia and Rose as Mama never failed to move Walter. In Lily's expanding understanding of family, love wasn't diminished by being shared, it multiplied. Benny had agreed to help with the transition, taking over more responsibilities at the shop during the day so Walter could focus on house preparations in the evenings. The young man seemed genuinely excited about the changes. "It's about time," he said, carrying boxes of Walter's personal belongings to his truck. "You've been hiding out back there long enough. Time to rejoin the world." The neighborhood had embraced the news of Walter's move with characteristic warmth. Mrs. Kowalski had organized a painting party, recruiting 6 volunteers to help refresh the interior walls. Father Martinez from St. Anthony's had donated furniture from the church's collection of donated goods. Even old Pete had contributed, insisting that Walter take the comfortable recliner chair from his barbershop's waiting area. "I'm getting a new one anyway," Pete claimed, though Walter suspected the chair had been sacrificed purely for his benefit. But beneath the excitement and activity, Walter carried a growing weight of anxiety. The closer they came to making the arrangement official, the more real it became, and the more real it became, the more opportunities he saw for everything to go wrong. What if he wasn't good enough at being part of a family? What if his years of isolation had damaged him too thoroughly to connect with people consistently? What if James changed his mind? What if something happened to Lily, and Walter had to navigate loss again, but this time with legal responsibilities and emotional investments he'd never asked for? The fears multiplied in the quiet hours when he lay on his narrow cot, surrounded by boxes and the dismantled remains of his solitary life. Change had always terrified him, but this change felt seismic, like stepping off solid ground into free fall with nothing but faith to catch him. James seemed to sense his struggle. One evening, as they worked together to install new light fixtures in the Birch Street house, he addressed Walter's unspoken fears directly. "You're having second thoughts," he said, adjusting a ceiling fan that had been giving them trouble. "Not second thoughts exactly," Walter replied, though that wasn't entirely true. "More like overwhelming awareness of all the ways this could go badly." "Such as?" Walter set down his screwdriver and looked around the half-finished living room. "Such as the fact that I've never been responsible for a child's well-being. Such as the fact that I don't know how to be part of a normal family. Such as the fact that I'm 57 years old and set in ways that might not be compatible with sharing my life." James was quiet for a long moment, considering Walter's words with the same careful attention he brought to business negotiations. "Can I tell you something about the night Patricia died?" he said finally. Walter nodded, understanding that he was about to hear something precious and painful. "I was terrified, not just of losing her, but of being left alone to raise Lily. I'd never changed a diaper by myself. I didn't know how to braid hair, or negotiate bedtime routines, or explain why some children don't have mothers. I felt completely inadequate for the job I'd inherited. But you learned, badly at first. I made mistakes, huge ones. I was too strict about some things and too permissive about others. I hired nannies to handle the parts of parenting I didn't understand, which was most of it. For the first 2 years, I was basically an emotionally absent provider who showed up for the big moments and missed most of the small ones." Walter could hear the self-recrimination in James's voice. The regret that came with hard-won wisdom. What changed? Lily did. She was 3 and she'd been asking for Patricia constantly, wanting to know when Mama was coming home, why she never visited, whether she was angry with us. I'd been deflecting the questions, telling her that Mama was in heaven, but avoiding the real conversation about death and permanence. James paused in his work, his hands stilling on the ceiling fan. "One night, she asked me point blank, 'Daddy, are you going to go away too?' Okay?" And I realized that my emotional distance wasn't protecting either of us. It was teaching her that love was temporary and people left. That's when I understood that being a perfect parent was less important than being a present one. Walter felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anxiety he'd been carrying. "The point is," James continued, "none of us know what we're doing when it comes to family. We just show up and try our best and hope that love covers the gaps in our knowledge. You've already proven you can do that, Walter. You've been doing it with Lily for months. But what if it's not enough? Then we figure it out together. That's what families do. They adapt, they support each other, they forgive each other's mistakes." James smiled, his expression warm with understanding. "Besides, Lily's already chosen you. The legal paperwork is just catching up to what's already true in her heart." That night, Walter walked through the house alone, imagining it filled with the sounds of daily life, Lily's laughter, James's occasional frustrated sighs at work calls, the music box playing in the evenings. He tried to picture himself cooking breakfast in the updated kitchen, reading bedtime stories in Lily's carefully planned bedroom, hosting neighborhood friends in the comfortable living room. The images felt both foreign and deeply right, like remembering a dream he'd had long ago and forgotten upon waking. In the garage, he found himself setting up his father's old toolbox on the workbench they'd installed along the far wall. The familiar weight of tradition and craftsmanship grounded him, connecting his past to this uncertain but hopeful future. Tomorrow they would finalize the guardianship papers. Tomorrow he would officially become part of something larger than himself. Tonight he allowed himself to believe that some things, the most important things, were worth the risk of heartbreak. "Yes," James said, reaching over to squeeze Walter's shoulder. "We do." The simple exchange illustrated something Walter had come to understand about their family. They'd moved beyond the tentative early stages of their relationship into something deeper and more secure. They'd learned to trust that their bond was strong enough to weather challenges, flexible enough to accommodate individual needs, and valuable enough to protect against external pressures. Later that morning, as they worked together in the garden, behind Walter's house, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. 8 months ago, he'd been a man living on the edges of other people's lives, invisible and alone. Now he was an integral part of a family, a valued member of his community, someone whose presence mattered in ways both large and small. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been awkward moments as they learned to navigate their new dynamics, disagreements about everything from discipline to dinner menus, tears of frustration when the learning curve felt too steep, but they'd worked through each challenge. Together, with patience and humor and the growing confidence that their love was strong enough to overcome temporary difficulties. "Uncle Walter," Lily said, pausing in her work weeding the tomato plants, "do you ever miss your old life, when it was just you and you didn't have to think about anyone else?" The question caught him off guard with its perceptiveness. She'd clearly been thinking about this for a while, probably triggered by James's mention of the job opportunity and the possibility of major change. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," he said honestly. "When you live alone, you don't have to coordinate schedules or compromise on dinner choices or worry about disappointing people you care about. But do you miss being lonely?" Walter looked around the garden where they were working together, at the house where he'd learned to feel at home, at the neighborhood where children waved to him from bicycle seats and elderly neighbors sought his advice on everything from car repairs to relationship problems. "No," he said with absolute certainty, "I never want to be that lonely again." "Good," Lily said, returning to her weeding with satisfaction, "because we never want you to be lonely either." That evening, after Mrs. Kowalski's party and the movie, and the gentle chaos of their Saturday routine, Walter found himself standing in his garden as the sun set behind the houses of his neighborhood. The same view he'd observed countless times, but now it looked entirely different than it had 8 months ago, when he'd first stood in this spot. Then he'd seen it as a foreign landscape, a place where he was trying to learn how to belong. Now it was simply home, not just the house or the yard, but the entire network of relationships and responsibilities and daily rhythms that gave his life meaning. Lily appeared beside him, her small hand slipping into his weathered one. She'd developed a habit of seeking him out during quiet moments, as if she understood that he still sometimes needed reassurance that their connection was real and permanent. "Uncle Walter," she said, "are you happy now?" The question was an echo of something she'd asked months ago, in those early days when their relationship was still tentative and uncertain. Then he hadn't known how to answer, hadn't dared to hope. That happiness was something he might be allowed to experience again. Now looking down at her upturned face, then across the yard to where James was visible through the kitchen window, cleaning up after their impromptu celebration, he felt the deep contentment that came from knowing exactly where he belonged in the world. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I'm happier than I ever thought possible." "Good," Lily said, squeezing his hand with the fierce protectiveness she'd inherited from her father. "Because you're stuck with us now, forever and ever." Walter squeezed back, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky above their perfectly imperfect family home. The evening air carried the sounds of their neighborhood settling into night, doors closing, televisions murmuring through open windows, the distant laughter of teenagers gathered on someone's front porch. Forever and ever, he agreed, meaning it with every fibre of his healing heart. The music box Lily had left on the workbench caught the last rays of sunlight through the garage window, its brass nameplate gleaming like a promise. Tomorrow was her 7th birthday, and they would celebrate with cake and presents and the joyful chaos that had become their family's specialty. There would be neighbors to welcome, games to organize, memories to create and treasure, but tonight was for quiet gratitude, for standing in his garden with the little girl who'd saved his life by asking if she could buy him, for marveling at the mysterious alchemy that had transformed 3 separate lonely hearts into something whole and beautiful and strong. Walter Pine had found his way home at last, not to a place but to a people, not to perfection but to love, that was patient enough to heal old wounds and brave enough to risk new ones. The man who'd once sat invisible on a curb eating lunch alone now stood surrounded by evidence of his belonging. A garden planted with hope, a house filled with laughter, a family that had chosen him as surely as he had chosen them. The stars wheeled overhead, witness to this small miracle of connection, this proof that love, when offered freely and accepted gratefully, really could work the kind of magic that transformed ordinary lives into something extraordinary. Story. Lily appeared beside him, her small hand slipping into his weathered one. "Uncle Walter," she said, "are you happy now?" He looked down at her upturned face, then across the yard to where James was visible through the kitchen window, cleaning up after their impromptu celebration. He thought about Rose and the daughter he'd never gotten to meet, about the years of grief and isolation, about the afternoon when a little girl with coins in her hands had asked if she could buy him. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick, with gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I'm happier than I ever thought possible." "Good," Lily said, squeezing his hand, "because you're stuck with us now, forever and ever." Walter squeezed back, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky above their perfectly imperfect family home. "Forever and ever," he agreed, and meant it with every fibre of his healing heart. Most mornings began the same way. Lily would slip through the back door, connecting the garage to the house, still in her pajamas and fuzzy slippers, carrying 2 cups of the terrible instant coffee she insisted on making herself. She'd gotten better at it over the months, but Walter still had to bite his tongue to keep from laughing when she added what she considered the perfect amount of sugar, enough to qualify as dessert rather than beverage. "What are we working on today, Uncle Walter?" she would ask, surveying his current projects with the interest of a true apprentice. The routine had become sacred to both of them. These early morning moments, before James left for work and before Lily had to get ready for school, belonged entirely to them. It was their time to plan the day, discuss whatever was on Lily's mind, and simply enjoy each other's company without the demands of schedules or obligations. Today's question came as usual, but Walter was prepared with a special answer. "Today, we're working on something just for you," he said, revealing the music box from beneath a paint-stained cloth. Lily's eyes widened as she took in the carefully sanded wood, the intricate hinges Walter had installed with painstaking precision, the small brass nameplate engraved with her name and the date she'd first asked to buy him, a detail that had required him to consult his worn pocket calendar to get exactly right. "You made this for me? Open it." She lifted the lid with reverent care, and the opening notes of "You Are My Sunshine" filled the workshop. But instead of a traditional dancing ballerina, Walter had crafted a tiny wooden figure of a little girl with tools in her hands, standing beside a miniature car with its hood raised. The figure was painted with meticulous attention to detail, dark curls like Lily's own, a purple dress like the one she'd worn to her 6th birthday party, and an expression of concentration that captured her perfectly when she was learning something new. "It's me," Lily whispered, "learning to fix things." "It's you being exactly who you are," Walter corrected gently, "curious and kind and capable of anything you set your mind to." She traced the tiny figure with one finger, her expression soft with wonder. The craftsmanship was some of Walter's finest work. Weeks of careful carving and sanding and painting, all done in stolen moments when Lily wasn't around to spoil the surprise. Every detail had been considered, from the miniature wrench in the figure's hand to the tiny spark plugs scattered around the base. "Will you teach me to make things like this? If you want to learn, I'll teach you everything I know." "I want to learn everything," she said with the fierce certainty that had characterized their friendship from the beginning. "I want to know how to make beautiful things with my hands, like you do." The back door opened, and James appeared with his own coffee cup and the relaxed expression of a Saturday morning. The past months had transformed him as much as they'd changed Walter. The perpetual tension had left his shoulders, replaced by the comfortable confidence of a man who'd found his balance between work and family. He'd learned to delegate more at the office, to say no to unnecessary travel, to protect their family time with the same intensity he'd once reserved for business deals. "Good morning," he said, kissing the top of Lily's head and admiring the music box. "That's beautiful work, Walter. She's going to treasure it forever. Uncle Walter made it just for me," Lily announced, winding the mechanism to hear the song again. The melody filled the garage, sweet and clear and full of memories. "And he's going to teach me to make things too." "Lucky you," James said, settling onto a work stool Walter had added specifically for these family conversations. "What's the agenda for today?" The weekends had developed their own rhythm over the months. Saturday mornings belonged to family projects, gardening, home repairs, cooking experiments that sometimes succeeded spectacularly and sometimes resulted in ordering takeout. Saturday afternoons were for community activities, neighborhood barbecues, youth league baseball games, where Lily cheered enthusiastically from the stands, visits to elderly neighbors who'd come to depend on their regular check-ins. "Mrs. Kowalski's birthday party this afternoon," Walter said, consulting the family calendar they'd started keeping on the garage wall. "She's turning 76, and she's insisted on celebrating in the backyard so she can show off her prize-winning roses. And then movie night," Lily added. "It's my turn to pick, so we're watching the one about the robot who learns to love." These routines had become the backbone of their shared life. Community celebrations, family traditions, quiet evenings that reinforced their bonds through simple presence and shared attention. Walter marveled at how naturally they'd all adapted to this new configuration, how seamlessly their individual needs had woven together into something that served everyone. Walter's auto shop had thrived in ways he'd never expected. Word had spread about the mechanic who'd become part of the Carlyle family, and customers came not just for his expertise, but for the warmth of a business rooted in community connection. People lingered to chat about their lives, asked advice about more than just automotive problems, brought their children around to meet the man they'd heard so much about. Benny had officially become his partner, handling more of the day-to-day operations, while Walter focused on the complex repairs that required decades of experience. The young man had proven himself not just mechanically gifted, but also wise about people, with an intuitive understanding of customer service that complemented Walter's technical skills perfectly. "I have news," James said, his tone suggesting something important. "I've been offered a promotion that would require relocating to the corporate headquarters." Walter felt his stomach drop, the familiar fear of loss rising in his throat like bile. After all these months of stability and happiness, was it possible that their family was about to be torn apart by circumstances beyond their control? But Lily looked up from her music box with calm curiosity, showing none of the panic Walter was struggling to hide. "Where is that?" she asked, her voice matter-of-fact. "Chicago. It's a significant opportunity. More money, more responsibility, a chance to shape company policy at the highest levels. It would mean leaving here, leaving our community, leaving Uncle Walter." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything they'd built together. Walter forced himself to breathe, to wait, to let James finish what he clearly needed to say. He'd learned over the months that James chose his words carefully, that there was usually more to his announcements than the initial revelation suggested. "So I turned it down," James continued with a small smile. Some things are more important than career advancement. This family, this community, this life we've created, it's worth more than any promotion could offer. Relief flooded through Walter so powerfully that he had to grip the edge of his workbench for support. The fear that had gripped him moments before dissolved into profound gratitude for this man who'd chosen love over ambition, family over professional success. Lily, however, seemed unsurprised by her father's decision. "Of course you turned it down," she said matter-of-factly. "We belong here. We belong together. Why would we want to go somewhere else when we already have everything we need right here?" The afternoon passed in a blur of unpacking and arranging. Lily appointed herself supervisor, directing the placement of furniture and decorations with the authority of someone who'd been planning this moment for weeks. Her vision for the house was both practical and whimsical. She wanted Walter's reading chair positioned where he could see both the garden and the front window, so he could watch for visitors while enjoying natural light. She insisted on hanging Rose's old kitchen towels in Walter's new kitchen, because Mama Rose should be part of this house too. The music box took its place of honor on the living room bookshelf, surrounded by photographs that chronicled their unlikely journey to family. There was the picture from Lily's birthday party, showing all three of them laughing over cake. There was a candid shot Nora had taken of Walter teaching Lily to check tire pressure in the shop. There was even a formal portrait they'd commissioned the week before, their first official family photo, taken at a studio downtown where Lily had insisted they all wear their fancy clothes. Benny worked alongside them with cheerful efficiency, carrying boxes and assembling furniture with the easy camaraderie that had developed between him and Walter over the past 2 years. "This feels right," he said as they set up Walter's new workshop in the garage. "You were hiding out in that shop for too long. Time to live like you mean it." "I'm not sure I remember how," Walter admitted, arranging his tools on the new workbench. "Lucky for you, you've got the best teachers," Benny replied, nodding toward the house, where Lily's laughter could be heard through the open windows. As evening approached, the volunteers gradually departed, leaving Walter, James, and Lily alone in their new shared space. The house felt different with people in it, warmer, more alive, full of possibility and the comfortable chaos that came with families in motion. Walter found himself walking from room to room, touching surfaces and opening cabinets, trying to absorb the reality of having this much space, this much comfort, this much evidence of belonging. The kitchen was larger than his entire living area had been in the shop. The bedroom had windows on 2 walls and a closet bigger than some apartments he'd lived in as a young man. But more than the physical space, it was the emotional space that overwhelmed him. Room to grow, to make mistakes, to be part of something without losing himself in the process. "So," James said, surveying the lived-in chaos of moving boxes and hastily arranged furniture, "what do we do now?" The question hung in the air with gentle weight. They'd worked toward this moment for months, but none of them had really planned what would happen after the papers were signed and the boxes were unpacked. It was Lily who provided the answer, as she so often did. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 3 mismatched glasses and a bottle of sparkling apple cider that someone had left in the refrigerator. "Now, we have a toast," she announced with the certainty of someone who'd clearly thought this through, "to becoming a real family." She poured the cider with careful concentration, her tongue poking out slightly as she focused on not spilling. The glasses were different sizes, one from Walter's sparse collection, one from the Carlisle household, one that Mrs. Kowalski had contributed from her own kitchen. Like their family, they didn't match conventionally, but they served the same purpose. When all 3 glasses were full, Lily raised hers high with ceremonial seriousness. "To Uncle Walter, who teaches me that broken things can be fixed and that being different makes you special." "Not wrong," Walter felt his throat tighten. "To Daddy, who teaches me that love means showing up even when it's scary, and that family is something you choose every day, not just something you're born into." James's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "And to our family, which is different from other families but perfect for us, because we chose each other and we keep choosing each other. And that's the most important thing of all. Walter and James raised their glasses, both men struggling with emotions too large for words. To family, James said quietly, his voice thick with feeling. To second chances, Walter added, thinking about Rose and the life he'd thought was over, and this new life he'd never imagined possible. To love that multiplies instead of divides, Lily finished. With the wisdom of someone far older than her 7 years, they clinked their glasses together, the sound ringing clear in the quiet house. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the walls golden through windows that now belonged to all of them. The light caught the music box on the shelf, making it gleam like a precious jewel. Later, after they'd ordered pizza and eaten it on the floor of the living room because the dining table was still buried under boxes, after they'd watched a movie while lying on blankets spread across the hardwood floors, after Lily had fallen asleep between them with her head on Walter's shoulder and her feet in her father's lap, Walter found himself standing in his new bedroom doorway, looking out at a view he'd never imagined possible. Through the window, he could see the lights of James and Lily's house 3 blocks away. Not far, but far enough to maintain their independence, while staying close enough to remain truly connected. The perfect balance of togetherness and autonomy that defined their unconventional family. In his jacket pocket, the guardianship papers rustled softly as he moved. Official documentation of something that had been true in his heart for months. That love, once planted in fertile ground, could grow in ways that defied every expectation. The house settled around him with the creaks and sighs of a building adjusting to new occupants. But it felt welcoming rather than foreign, as if the walls themselves approved of this family that had chosen love over convention, connection over safety, hope over the familiar comfort of solitude. Walter Pine was no longer invisible. He was Uncle Walter now, and he belonged somewhere at last. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to love and be loved in return. Tonight, he allowed himself to feel the deep satisfaction of a man who had found his way home after wandering in the wilderness for far too long. In the living room, he could hear James gently waking Lily to carry her to her own bed in their house down the street. Soon, the house would be quiet except for the sounds of Walter's own breathing, his own heartbeat, his own presence in a space that was finally, truly his. But this solitude felt different from the isolation he'd known for so many years. This was chosen, quiet, peaceful solitude, the kind that came after connection rather than instead of it. This was the silence of a man who knew he was loved, who had people to return to, who belonged in the world in ways that mattered. As he prepared for his first night in his new home, Walter touched the wedding ring he still wore beneath his shirt, then looked at the family photos on his new dresser. Rose's image sat beside pictures of Lily and James, and somehow it felt right, the past and present coexisting without conflict. Love adding to love rather than replacing it. Thank you, he whispered to the quiet room to Rose, to whatever forces in the universe had conspired to bring Lily into his life on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon that had changed everything. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening rhythms. Children were called in for baths and bedtime stories. Porch lights came on. Dogs barked their evening conversations across yard fences. And Walter Pine, no longer a man living on the margins of other people's lives, became part of that gentle symphony of domestic contentment. He was home. Asleep between them during a movie, Walter found himself standing in his new bedroom doorway, looking out at a view he'd never imagined possible. Through the window, he could see the lights of James and Lily's house 3 blocks away. Not far, but far enough to maintain their independence, while staying close enough to remain truly connected. The perfect balance of togetherness and autonomy that defined their unconventional family. In his jacket pocket, the guardianship papers rustled softly as he moved. Official documentation of something that had been true in his heart for months, that love, once planted in fertile ground, could grow in ways that defied every expectation. Walter Pine was no longer invisible. He was Uncle Walter now, and he belonged somewhere at last. 8 months later, on a spring morning that sparkled with possibility, Walter stood in his garage workshop putting the finishing touches on a small wooden music box he'd been crafting for weeks. It was Lily's 7th birthday tomorrow, and this time he wanted to give her something made with his own hands, something that would last as long as their love for each other. The house on Birch Street had become everything they dreamed it could be and more. The kitchen table bore the comfortable scars of homework sessions and art projects, ring stains from countless cups of coffee and glasses of juice, small burns from the time Lily had insisted on helping make pancakes and had gotten too enthusiastic with the spatula. The living room bookshelves overflowed with a mixture of automotive manuals, children's stories, and James's business books, an eclectic library that perfectly reflected their blended family. The garden bloomed with flowers Lily had planted and vegetables Walter had coaxed from reluctant soil, creating a small Eden that drew compliments from neighbors and provided fresh produce for their dinner table. James's individual interview lasted longer, nearly 20 minutes. When he returned, his expression was calm, but Walter could see the relief in his eyes. The questions had apparently gone well. "Mr. Pine," Judge Morrison called, "your turn." The small conference room felt intimate and slightly less formal than the main courtroom. Judge Morrison poured 2 glasses of water and gestured for Walter to sit across from her at a simple wooden table. "This is quite an unusual case," she began, "but not unprecedented. I've seen guardianship arrangements like this work beautifully when all parties are genuinely committed to the child's welfare." Walter waited, understanding that she had more to say. "I want you to understand what you're signing up for," she continued. "Guardianship isn't honorary. If something happened to Mr. Carlyle, the courthouse steps felt more intimidating than any engine Walter had ever faced. He stood beside James, both men wearing their best clothes and carrying leather folders containing documents that would legally bind their lives together. Lily sat between them, swinging her legs and humming, "You Are My Sunshine," with the unconscious contentment of a child who trusted that adults would handle the complicated parts of life. "Mr. Pine? Mr. Carlyle?" A woman in a navy blazer approached them with a professional smile. "I'm Amanda Foster from Children's Services. Judge Morrison is ready to see you." Walter's stomach clenched. He'd known this moment would come. The official review, the questions about his background, his living situation, his ability to provide for a child. James had assured him that it was mostly a formality, that the paperwork was straightforward. But Walter couldn't shake the feeling that someone was about to discover he was fundamentally unsuited for this new role. The courtroom was smaller than he'd expected, less intimidating than the grand chambers he'd seen in movies. Judge Morrison was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes, and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades making decisions about families. "Please, sit down," she said, gesturing to the chairs arranged before her bench. "Lily, would you like to sit up here with me while we talk?" Lily nodded eagerly and allowed herself to be lifted to a special chair beside the judge. Walter marveled at her composure. She seemed to view the entire proceeding as an adventure rather than a life-altering legal process. "Now then," Judge Morrison said, reviewing the documents before her, "Mr. Carlyle, you're requesting that Mr. Pine be granted legal guardianship rights for your daughter Lily. This is somewhat unusual, as most guardianship cases involve situations where the biological parent is unable to care for the child." "Yes, Your Honor," James replied, "but we believe this arrangement serves Lily's best interests and provides her with additional security and stability. Mr. Pine," the judge turned to Walter, "you understand that guardianship comes with significant responsibilities. You would have legal authority to make decisions about Lily's welfare, education, and medical care in Mr. Carlyle's absence or incapacity." Walter's mouth felt dry. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand, and you're prepared to take on those responsibilities." For a moment, Walter's courage faltered. The weight of legal obligation, the possibility of making decisions that could affect Lily's entire future, the risk of failing someone who depended on him. It all seemed overwhelming. Then Lily turned in her chair to look at him, her dark eyes bright with trust and affection. And Walter remembered why they were here. Yes, Your Honor, I'm prepared. Judge Morrison smiled. Lily, do you understand what's happening today? We're making Walter officially part of our family, Lily said, with the confidence of someone explaining a simple mathematical equation. So if something happens to Daddy, Walter will take care of me. And if something happens to Walter, Daddy and I will take care of each other. And how do you feel about that arrangement? I think it's perfect, Lily said matter-of-factly. Walter teaches me how to fix things and listen to people and be kind. Daddy teaches me how to be smart and work hard and stand up for what's right. Together they teach me everything I need to know. Walter felt his eyes growing wet. In her childlike simplicity, Lily had articulated something he'd struggled to understand, that families weren't about perfection, but about completeness. Mr. Pine, the judge said gently, I see from your background check that you've had some difficult experiences in your past. The loss of your wife and child. How do we know that these new responsibilities won't be too emotionally challenging for you? The question was fair but painful. Walter took a breath, thinking about how to explain something he was still learning to understand himself. Your Honor, losing my family taught me how precious these relationships are. It also taught me that love isn't something we can control or guarantee. All we can do is choose to show up day after day and care for the people we're blessed to love while we have them. He looked at Lily, then at James. These two have given me a second chance at family I never expected. I can't promise that life won't bring challenges or heartbreak. Nobody can promise that. But I can promise that I'll face whatever comes with everything I have, because they're worth that commitment. Judge Morrison nodded slowly, reviewing the documents once more. The court recognizes that this is an unconventional arrangement, but the evidence suggests it serves the child's best interests. Mr. Pine, your references speak very highly of your character. The community assessment indicates that you're trusted and respected in your neighborhood. She picked up her pen. I'm prepared to grant the guardianship petition with the understanding that all parties will maintain open communication and that Lily's well-being remains the primary consideration in all decisions. Walter's heart hammered against his ribs as she signed the documents, each stroke of her pen binding him irrevocably to this new life. Congratulations, Judge Morrison said, handing James the official papers. You're now legally a family. Lily cheered and threw her arms around Walter's neck. James shook his hand with tears in his eyes. And Walter felt something he'd forgotten he was capable of feeling, unqualified, overwhelming joy. The celebration lunch at Lily's favorite restaurant felt surreal. Walter sat in a red vinyl booth, official guardianship papers folded in his jacket pocket, watching Lily methodically eat her way through a stack of pancakes while narrating her plans for their first official family dinner. And we'll use the good plates, the ones with the blue flowers that Daddy keeps in the high cabinet. And we'll light candles, because special occasions need candles. And maybe we can invite Mrs. Kowalski and Benny, because they help make this happen too. James smiled at her enthusiasm, but Walter could see the exhaustion around his eyes. The morning had been emotionally draining for all of them, though in the best possible way. Walter was still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The judge's signature had transformed him from a lonely man living in the margins to someone with legal standing in another person's life. The responsibility felt enormous, but so did the privilege. Walter, Lily said, pausing with her fork halfway to her mouth, now that you're officially my family, does that mean I can officially call you what I've been calling you in my head? What have you been calling me in your head? She grinned, suddenly shy. Uncle Walter, because you're not my daddy. I already have the best daddy, but you're not just a friend either. You're something in between, something special, Uncle Walter. The title settled into his chest like a warm coal, heating him from the inside out. He'd never been anyone's uncle, never expected to be. The word carried weight and warmth and belonging. "I would be honored to be your Uncle Walter," he said solemnly. "Really, really." The drive to the house on Birch Street felt like a pilgrimage. Walter sat in the passenger seat of James's car, watching familiar neighborhoods pass by with new eyes. Everything looked different now that he officially belonged somewhere, now that he had legal papers proving he was part of something larger than himself. The moving trucks had already arrived. Many waved from the driveway, surrounded by boxes and furniture pieces that represented 15 years of Walter's solitary existence. It was humbling to see how little space his material life actually occupied, and how much lighter he felt, leaving most of it behind. Mrs. Kowalski had outdone herself in their absence. She stood in the doorway of the house like a general surveying successful battle plans, directing a small army of neighborhood volunteers who had spent the morning making the space sparkle. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen table. The refrigerator had been stocked with essentials, and someone had even made up the bed in Walter's new bedroom with crisp white sheets that smelled like fabric softener and hope. "Welcome home," she said, embracing Walter with fierce affection. "It's about time you had a proper home." The words hit him unexpectedly hard. Home, not just a place to sleep or store his belongings, but a real home where he belonged, where he was wanted, where his presence mattered to the daily rhythm of life. The courthouse steps felt more intimidating than any engine Walter had ever faced. He stood beside James, both men wearing their best clothes and carrying leather folders containing documents that would legally bind their lives together. Lily sat between them, swinging her legs and humming. "You are my sunshine," with the unconscious contentment of a child who trusted that adults would handle the complicated parts of life. The morning had begun with nervous energy that infected all three of them. Walter had woken before dawn, unable to sleep, and had found himself sitting in his soon-to-be former home behind the shop, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise through the grimy windows one last time. James had arrived early, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of anxiety around the edges. Even Lily, typically fearless in new situations, had been quieter than usual over breakfast. "Mr. Pine, Mr. Carlyle." A woman in a navy blazer approached them with a professional smile. "I'm Amanda Foster from Children's Services. Judge Morrison is ready to see you." Walter's stomach clenched. He'd known this moment would come. The official review, the questions about his background, his living situation, his ability to provide for a child. James had assured him that it was mostly a formality, that the paperwork was straightforward. But Walter couldn't shake the feeling that someone was about to discover he was fundamentally unsuited for this new role. The courthouse. Corridors echoed with their footsteps as they followed. Miss Foster toward the family court chambers. Walter noticed everything with hyper-aware clarity. The institutional green paint on the walls, the smell of floor wax and paper, the way their shoes clicked against polished linoleum that had seen thousands of families navigate life-changing moments. "Are you nervous, Uncle Walter?" Lily asked, slipping her small hand into his as they walked. "A little," he admitted. "Me too," she whispered. "But the good kind of nervous, like when you're about to open a present you really want." Her simple wisdom cut through his anxiety like sunshine through clouds. This wasn't a trial or a test, it was a celebration, a legal recognition of something that already existed in their hearts. The courtroom was smaller than he'd expected, less intimidating than the grand chambers he'd seen in movies. Judge Morrison was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades making decisions about families. Her desk was organized but not sterile, with family photographs visible alongside legal documents. "Please, sit down," she said, gesturing to the chairs arranged before her bench. "Lily, would you like to sit up here with me while we talk?" Lily nodded eagerly and allowed herself to be lifted to a special chair beside the judge. Walter marveled at her composure. She seemed to view the entire proceeding as an adventure rather than a life-altering legal process. "Now then," Judge Morrison said, reviewing the documents before her with careful attention, "Mr. Carlyle, You're requesting that Mr. Pine be granted legal guardianship rights for your daughter Lily. This is somewhat unusual, as most guardianship cases involve situations where the biological parent is unable to care for the child. Yes, Your Honor, James replied, his voice steady despite the slight tremor in his hands. But we believe this arrangement serves Lily's best interests and provides her with additional security and stability. Judge Morrison made notes on a legal pad, her pen moving with practiced efficiency. Mr. Pine, I've reviewed your background check, your financial records, and the character references submitted on your behalf. The community assessment speaks very highly of your integrity and reliability. Walter felt his shoulders relax slightly. The character references had been James's idea. Letters from Mrs. Kowalski, Father Martinez, Old Pete, and several customers whose vehicles he'd maintained over the years. He'd been touched by their willingness to vouch for him, though he'd also been nervous about what they might say. However, the judge continued, I need to understand the practical implications of this arrangement. Mr. Pine, you understand that guardianship comes with significant responsibilities. You would have legal authority to make decisions about Lily's welfare, education, and medical care in Mr. Carlyle's absence or incapacity. Walter's mouth felt dry. The weight of legal obligation, the possibility of making decisions that could affect Lily's entire future, the risk of failing someone who depended on him, it all seemed overwhelming. Yes, Your Honor, I understand. And you're prepared to take on those responsibilities? For a moment, Walter's courage faltered. He thought about all the ways he could disappoint this little girl who'd placed such faith in him, all the parenting decisions he'd never had to make, all the emergencies and challenges he couldn't anticipate. Then Lily turned in her chair to look at him, her dark eyes bright with trust and affection, and Walter remembered why they were here. Not because he was perfect, but because love had grown between them organically, naturally, without agenda or expectation. Yes, Your Honor, I'm prepared. Judge Morrison smiled. The first time, her professional demeanor had softened. Lily, do you understand what's happening today? We're making Walter officially part of our family, Lily said, with the confidence of someone explaining a simple mathematical equation. So if something happens to Daddy, Walter will take care of me, and if something happens to Walter, Daddy and I will take care of each other. And how do you feel about that arrangement? I think it's perfect, Lily said matter-of-factly. Walter teaches me how to fix things and listen to people and be kind. Daddy teaches me how to be smart and work hard and stand up for what's right. Together they teach me everything I need to know. Walter felt his eyes growing wet. In her childlike simplicity, Lily had articulated something he'd struggled to understand, that families weren't about perfection, but about completeness. That's a very mature way to think about it, Judge Morrison said gently. Mr. Pine, I see from your background check that you've had some difficult experiences in your past. The loss of your wife and child. How do we know that these new responsibilities won't be too emotionally challenging for you? The question was fair but painful. Walter took a breath, thinking about how to explain something he was still learning to understand himself. Your Honor, losing my family taught me how precious these relationships are. It also taught me that love isn't something we can control or guarantee. All we can do is choose to show up day after day and care for the people we're blessed to love while we have them. He looked at Lily, then at James. These two have given me a second chance at family I never expected. I can't promise that life won't bring challenges or heartbreak. Nobody can promise that. But I can promise that I'll face whatever comes with everything I have. Because they're worth that commitment. Miss Foster, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the hearing, spoke up for the first time. Your Honor, I've conducted extensive interviews with Mr. Pine's references, and the consensus is remarkable. Every person I spoke with described him as reliable, kind, and deeply committed to his community. Several mentioned specific instances where he went above and beyond to help neighbors in need. What about Mr. Pine's living situation? The judge asked. The guardianship petition mentions a recent change in housing. Yes, Your Honor, James answered. Mr. Pine has secured appropriate housing near our family residence. The arrangement allows for both independence and close proximity, which we believe serves everyone's interests. Judge Morrison nodded slowly, making additional notes. I'd like to speak with each of you individually, starting with Lily. Gentlemen, if you could step outside for a few minutes. Walter's anxiety spiked as they left Lily alone with the judge. What if she said something that revealed doubts he didn't know she had? What if the judge asked questions that confused or frightened her? She'll be fine, James said quietly as they waited in the corridor. Lily's been looking forward to this day for weeks. She knows exactly what she wants. Through the small window in the courtroom door, Walter could see Lily animated in conversation with Judge Morrison, her small hands gesturing expressively as she explained something with obvious enthusiasm. Whatever question the judge had asked, Lily was answering with her characteristic combination of seriousness and joy. After 10 minutes, they were called back in. Lily beamed at them from her perch beside the judge's bench, clearly pleased with how the private conversation had gone. "Mr. Carlyle," Judge Morrison said. "Your turn." James squeezed Walter's shoulder before following the judge to a small conference room adjacent to the main chamber. Walter sat with Lily, both of them quiet as they waited. "What did the judge ask you?" Walter whispered. "She wanted to know if I was sure about wanting you to be my guardian," Lily whispered back. "And if I understood what that meant, and if anyone had ever told me to say things that weren't true, what did you tell her?" "I told her that nobody had to tell me to love you, and that you already take care of me, even though it's not official yet, and that families are supposed to be the people who choose each other on purpose." Walter's throat tightened with emotion. "That's exactly right.